Good afternoon and welcome to Reimagining How Chicago Ends Homelessness, Turning Data into Action. I'm Nelsen, Manager of City Policy at Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness and the primary author on the 2026 Chicago Homelessness Estimate. Today, we will briefly present on this year's data before turning it over to our amazing panel of experts. Some quick things that might be helpful for you all to know. First, please use the question and answer function to ask questions. My colleague Sam will be monitoring it and will respond to some questions as we go along. We have also reserved 10 minutes at the end of the panel to answer some questions for you all together. We will also be recording this webinar, and we will share it with you and others after we're done. Another note, my colleagues should be dropping the link to the formal report, which is a wonderful webpage on our CCH site for you all to view and please share with others. With that, I will get started by sharing a little bit about the work of Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness. Since 1980, Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness has advocated, my apologies. Since 1980, Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness has advocated for everyone to have a safe, welcoming, and permanent place to call home. CCH builds community power and advances racial equity through organizing, advocacy, legal assistance, and education. We strive to prevent and end homelessness because housing is a human right. And now, more than ever, we know that we must come together as a community to uphold that right. Crucial for today's discussion is a grounding in the understanding of what homelessness is. Homelessness describes a situation where someone lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. But what is considered fixed, regular, and adequate depends on the federal agency. This is necessary to understand in order to understand policy around homelessness. So I'm going to address two of the most relevant federal definitions today. First, that of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is the primary funder for most housing services in the United States. HUD defines homelessness as a situation in which people that do not have a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence and are staying in one of the following: a public or private place not meant for human habitation, a publicly or privately operated shelter designed to provide temporary living arrangements, including congregate shelters, transitional housing, and hotels or motels. And finally, people staying in an institution where they resided for less than 90 days and an institution where someone has resided for less than 90 days and who resided in a shelter or place not meant for human habitation before that institution and will return to such a situation upon leaving that institution. In contrast, the Department of Education defines homelessness as people that do not have a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, including sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason, living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds, living in emergency or transitional housing or an abandoned hospital or abandoned in hospitals, primary nighttime residence that is a public or private place not designed for human habitation, not usually used as sleeping accommodations. People who are living in cars, parks, public places, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, bus or train stations, or similar settings. And they also include migratory children. You may be wondering, why do these definitions and the difference between them matter? Defining homelessness is the first step toward ending homelessness. Accurate counts of people experiencing homelessness determine which communities receive essential housing, transportation, and public health assistance. The next step in understanding the scope of the issue brings us to this year's estimate. By the most recent data available, we estimate that 58,625 people experienced homelessness through the course of a year in Chicago. This is inclusive both of people that have stayed in emergency shelter or in a place not meant for human habitation, and those experiencing doubled up homelessness, meaning poor people staying in overcrowded, poor households and who are unable to formally contribute to household expenses. In the 10 years we have been doing this estimate, we've observed year-to-year changes in this number. This chart shows us that year-to-year fluctuation and breaks out the number of people experiencing street and shelter homelessness compared to people who have experienced doubled up homelessness. Notably, there was a peak in 2022 with 76,375 people. In particular, we saw that there was a significant increase in people experiencing street and shelter homelessness through that year. You may also note that rates appear to have decreased from 2022 through 2024. We argue that there are two main reasons for this decrease. First, the American Rescue Act plan, which was federal COVID relief, as well as state and local initiatives, created a temporary influx in resources to target homelessness and related needs. Likewise, temporary policies, such as eviction moratoriums, assisted some in gaining stable housing and prevented others from entering homelessness. Second, with the consistent increase in rent and other costs in Chicago, we know that people are being forced out of the city altogether. Although there is this overall decrease, there are increases among certain demographics, which I'll return to shortly. The other key takeaway from the overall estimate is that doubled up homelessness is and has been the primary way that people experience homelessness in Chicago. In 2024, about 39,000 people experienced being doubled up, while around 19,000 stayed in shelter or on the streets. This is particularly important because the point-in-time count, the way the Department of Housing and Urban Development counts homelessness, which we will discuss further in the panel, only counts people that are seen to be experiencing street and sheltered homelessness. Thus, the federal government overlooks the majority of people experiencing homelessness. Back to my point about demographics. It's important to address race and ethnicity because homelessness is an issue of racism. Specifically, I want to point out that Black and African American identified people experience homelessness at a disproportionate rate. While Black folk make up about 30% of Chicago's population, they represent over 50% of people experiencing homelessness. And importantly, while the overall rates of homelessness have dropped through 2023 and 2024, the rates of both street and shelter homelessness and doubled up homelessness continues to increase for Black Chicagoans. Likewise, we want to point out what we observe in regard to regard to age. Note that because of how we receive data, we unfortunately cannot provide further breakout than what you're seeing here. A concerning trend we see is that homelessness is actually increasing among very young children. This is likely demonstrating increasing impacts of generational homelessness and points to policy failings. Our full report includes more demographic information, and I highly encourage you to go check that out. Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness has a few takeaways from this data in context of the current homelessness-related policy. First, resources do work when they are flexible and available to people who experience various sorts of homelessness. However, federal policies are increasingly hostile toward people experiencing homelessness, which is compounded by significant housing resource cuts. Thus, we are very worried this overall trend will quickly reverse, potentially rising above even past highs. And this will not just be due to housing resources. Other cuts, such as those for food, mental health supports, amongst others, will push more people into homelessness. Finally, new policies that do not allow services to be grounded in diversity, equity, and inclusion will increase barriers for Black, LGBTQ+, and otherwise systematically marginalized people, only worsening this form of oppression and outcomes for those already bearing its brunt. On that note, I would like to introduce you to our panel of experts and advocates to discuss what these findings mean for how we understand homelessness in Chicago and how we should respond. Our panel includes Evie Alexander, who is a grassroots organizer, rising leader, and board member with the Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness. She was recently recognized at our annual victory celebration for her leadership in reinvigorating CCH Homeless Youth Committee. Shannon Lynn Parker is a dedicated advocate and leader, as well as the CEO of Equality Illinois, the state's oldest and largest LGBTQ plus civil rights organization. She is the first Black transgender woman to lead the organization in its 34-year history. Brian Goldstone is a journalist and the author of There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America, a finalist for the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, and named one of the best 10 books of 2025 by the New York Times and The Atlantic. Our panel will be moderated by Karenina Grimble, former president and longtime member of the CCH Board of Directors. She currently serves as the director of the Office of Strategy, Equity, and Transformation at the Illinois Department of Human Services. Take it away, Karenina.
Karenina, you're muted.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much. I'm Karenina Grimble, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. Thank you for all of you who have joined us. And with that, we're going to jump right in. We're going to spend a few minutes setting the stage here. And we'll start with you, Brian. As you know, the Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness's definition of homelessness includes a variety of unstable housing situations, like couch surfing and staying in hotels or motels. Your book shares the personal stories of 5 families in Atlanta who had varying experiences of homelessness and housing instability. What did you learn about the scope and drivers of homelessness through this process of writing your book, your years of research, building relationships with people who are forced into homelessness, despite their very desperate efforts to keep their families in stable housing?
Mm, yeah, I promise I will answer that question, but I first want to just say what a total honor and privilege it is to be with all of you this afternoon or this evening, getting to evening here in Atlanta where I am. CCH has been just completely crucial for so many of us trying to understand not only the nature of homelessness in this country, but the true magnitude and scope of homelessness. And there's so much in my book that would have been impossible without CCH. And so I just want to name that and acknowledge it and just say how grateful I am. And also just to be with my fellow panelists. I have no illusions in as the author of this book, as someone who spent you know over 6 years or nearly 6 years following five families in Atlanta, which resulted in this book. I have no illusions about being some kind of like lone voice in the wilderness or some kind of like visionary who's coming up with something on my own. Like all I've done in this book is basically like spend time with these five families and with many other people like them and just trying to like give their experiences and give their stories a platform and to do justice to the singularity of their experiences, but also show how what they have gone through is very much representative of what millions, not hundreds of thousands, but millions of other men, women, and children in this country have been forced to suffer and go through. So I'm very grateful. And yeah, so you asked what did I learn about the scope and drivers of homelessness in the course of reporting this book? It's a good question because both the scope and the drivers they're intimately connected. One thing that I found, and I apologize if I just use the word like shocking or astonished a lot through this conversation, but one thing that really shocked me when I began this work back in 2018 or so was that there's this entire world of homelessness that is out of sight, that is not just invisible, but has been actively rendered invisible. I've come to think of it as a kind of manufactured invisibility. And we heard a little bit about that already through these sort of competing definitions of homelessness that seem really technical or, kind of yeah, like, okay, so what's the big deal? There are these different definitions, but those competing definitions have had monumental consequences in the lives of so many people. And one way that those competing definitions have showed up, the fact that this much narrower definition, the one that HUD uses, is really the one that not only determines what resources and services people can access, which is a vital question, and hopefully we can come back to that. But it also crucially shapes the public perception of homelessness in this country. And so that very narrow definition has led to also a very narrow sense of, again, not only the scale and severity of homelessness in America, but its causes, and what homelessness looks like. And so, what I realized was that what we see on the street, as bad as it is, as horrific as homelessness has become visibly in America, so unnecessarily, as the result of just the shredding of the safety net. And I also just want to be clear, since the question of drivers was already mentioned, that if everyone tuning in takes nothing else away from this conversation, please let it be that like what causes homelessness is, and I know this is going to blow everyone's mind, is not having a home, like not having access to a home that you can afford. That is what causes homelessness. But what homelessness looks like and how it manifests, it can be very different depending on where you're looking. And the tents really just being the tip of the iceberg. In some ways, what my book is about is that much, much bigger iceberg that's under the water surface, that is out of sight. And that incidentally is like overwhelmingly made up of families with children. It's also overwhelmingly made up of people who are in the workforce, the labor force, the low wage workforce, the gigified workforce. And so the subtitle of my book, Working and Homeless in America, is really meant to signal not some tiny subpopulation within this larger world of homelessness of, a couple of people here and there who have jobs. Um, I argue that these families, these people who are in the labor force who have been, and I've been really careful to discipline my language. These families did not fall into homelessness. They did not stumble into this. They were pushed into homelessness. Um, that they do belong to a really mammoth population. And I know we're going to be talking more about the importance of data and numbers as this conversation goes on. But they belong to a very big population, and and it's a matter of their wages, their poverty wages in many cases, simply being increasingly out of sync with what it costs to have a place to live. And also the changing nature of work itself, not just the low wages, but that work itself has become ever more volatile, ever more insecure and precarious, as well as all these other colliding systems, a lack of affordable childcare, a lack of affordable health care, all these really uniquely American failures, American maladies, all the forms of debt that we've managed to inflict on people, medical debt, student debt, all of this has come together to make the crisis that this book documents not just possible, but I would argue in many ways predictable and even inevitable.
Well, thank you so much for this, Brian. Um, Shannon, we're going to move on to you. As an advocate and a former provider, you have worked directly with people um, going through the trauma and instability that homelessness causes. Based, what are some of the common factors and experiences that lead people to seek shelter and services through the homeless services system?
All right. Well, hey, y'all. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. Oh, wow. What a big question. But I will be succinct as possible because, man, I can go on forever with that one. The reality is that people enter homelessness because of compounded crises. There isn't typically one singular event that causes that, although it could. Um, but again, it's typically because of compounded crisis. And what I mean by that is so oftentimes when we think about people who are experiencing homelessness, we think about personal failure. And that is furthest from the truth, more than likely. So think about it. Just as Brand said earlier, think about the moment that we're in: rising rents, um, job loss, medical emergencies, mental health, domestic violence, right? People who are, we forget about populations of folks who are escaping financial abuse, you know, and so many other things. Family rejection. We see that particularly so often within the LGBTQ community, more narrowly trans community. How can I put it? When you really think about it, discrimination collapses already thin margins, if that makes sense, right? We're working with people who already live and exist on such thin margins as it is. So when you add discrimination to this, oh my goodness, you've got this powder keg. So most people seek services only after exhausting every informal option to stay housed. And when I say informal options, I'm talking about the couch surfing, you know, um, the going from place to place. And eventually your back is up against the wall. And this is the end result. I will close out by saying, at the end of the day, it is a system failure. We're not to look at the individual, it is a system that has to be looked at. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And appreciate you bringing in the systemic challenges involved here. Evie, you are a grassroots leader and have experienced homelessness. Can you share what that looks like for you and how your personal experience may have been different from some of the common assumptions many people have or had about homelessness and the people who experience homelessness?
Yeah, I would love to. Um, So my story started very on in my life. In a way, I've always felt like that homelessness has been something that was haunting me. I experienced childhood instability for as long as I could remember. We would move very often. At times, we lived in abandoned houses. And during this period, my siblings and I were not consistently enrolled in school for sometimes years at a time. Um, what's hard to understand, though, looking back, is that there were so many systems that you think would intervene in my situation where it was around 10 to 12 children at the time, going from place to place, not being enrolled in school, not having adequate food, clothes, and resources, and none of the systems that were around to protect us, to truancy officers, no one stepped in. And so it is just something that's always been a part of my life. Um, and as well, that was my reality for years. And then upon turning 10, I entered into foster care. And some of you may not know, but when you are a youth in care, you are legally considered homeless. And so foster care is its own form of housing instability because when your foster parent trains, a lot of times your home would change as well. And so being moved from placement to placement or having my foster parent change created a sense of just like this psychological not having a place to be, not having a place to belong. And it followed me throughout my entire life. And so this is how I learned early on to survive even without stability. And so while I was just trying to move forward and do the things that I was supposed to do, I was working since I was 15. Um, I graduated my high school top 10 in my class. I earned a lot of scholarship to attend Loyola University, Chicago. Even with that, I still had an insurmountable amount of out-of-pocket costs that would require me to work two jobs and still not be able to afford my housing because Loyola requires students to dorm the first 2 years of college. And so, even with that, me being forced to dorm during the times that I was in a dorm, I would not have any place to go. And it finally dawned on me when I seen everybody else parents come picking them up, and no one was coming to pick me up. No one was, saying like, "Oh, what are you gonna do for the holidays?" And I'm just like saying like, "Hey, where am I even gonna sleep?" And so fortunately, I was able to reach out to my university, and they was able to provide me with support, knowing I didn't have any other housing. They were able to provide me for support with housing. But during that time, I didn't speak up and say, hey, I don't even have food. And so when you're experiencing housing instability, it makes things a lot more difficult. And so I developed insomnia due to these instabilities and just like not having a place to call home, a place to return to physically, socially, it derailed a large part of my life. And so by the time I was in my fourth year of college, I had the biggest impending doom of, I really will not have any place to go to. I will not have a dorm to return to. I will not have anybody to rely on. I had to figure something out very quickly, and I called around. And because I was currently in that dorm, knowing I had nowhere else to go to, a lot of programs were unable to assist me at that time because they didn't consider me homeless. And so eventually I was able to stumble upon somebody I met in my past who would open up their doors to me. And unfortunately, that was not a safe situation. I was doubled up. I was on the couch. There were not enough room for me to even be there. And it was a very unsafe situation, which eventually led to me entering into a shelter system. And since then, I've been in shelters, I've been in hotels, I've been in Airbnbs. And even to this day, homelessness is something that continues to loom over me because, as many of us, we could all be one or two paychecks away. If we lose that income, we don't really know how we're going to maintain our housing. And the housing is just like the one of the most basic things that you need to be a full human being. And so it's just really unfortunate because I had to give up my education. I had to withdraw from my courses. And so I'm now in the process of trying to rebuild those things, but it's still this looming, this sense of like, when is it going to happen again? What's going to come up? And something so small as such as a policy determining what homelessness is going to make or break me being able to get some vital resources. And so that's what I would, yeah, that's been my personal experiences with the housing instability.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for helping to draw a through line between some of the things that we're discussing here today. Um, Brian, we're going to move to you because something that Evie said, I think, is going to help us tie some of this together. In your book, you describe the heartbreaking reality of just the dearth of support and resources available to people who are on the brink, much of what we just heard Evie talk about. Will you talk about any trends you've noticed through your research regarding the kinds of supports available to people experiencing homelessness? Like who receives help, who's left out, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, one of the guiding kind of impulses or even a kind of mission statement for this book while I was doing the reporting, I sort of came to after the fact. I recently had a conversation with one of my heroes. Her name's Sarah Nelsen. She's the head of the flight attendant union. She's a labor dynamo. And after she read the book, she said it occurred to her that before we can fix this crisis, we first have to feel the crisis. And nowhere for me was that truer than in the process of like witnessing families try to access services, try to access resources, and the ways that they were turned away. The not only the unanswered phone calls and the calling the numbers and getting this number is no longer in service or this voicemail is full and is no longer accepting messages. But when there actually were face-to-face meetings, how dehumanizing that could sometimes be. Not in all cases, there are some bright spots in the book, people who are showing up for their neighbors, and I would love to talk about them. But they really are the exceptions, I think, to the rule, at least in what I witnessed. If I could just very briefly describe one situation, just again to put a human face on this, and I have found that what Celeste, who I'm about to tell you about, what she went through is very much endemic. It is very much representative of what people go through all the time. Um, I won't tell Celeste's whole story, but suffice it to say that she is pushed into homelessness after her rental home burns down, and her landlord, with this private equity firm, files an eviction against her on this home that had burned down. Unbeknownst to Celeste, she only found out about this eviction filed against her months later. And by then it was too late. The eviction had already been handed down. Her credit score, this three-digit number that has come to determine whether millions of people in this country have access to something as basic as a place to live, her credit score was destroyed. And at that point, Celeste and her children, after sleeping in their car and being terrified by the way that those nights sleeping in her car, that the cops would knock on the window. And, Celeste knew anecdotally that a lot of child removals in Georgia, and to put a number on it, it's over a third of child removals are the direct result of what is officially categorized as inadequate housing. Celeste was terrified that the police would come and take her kids away. So finally, they did what scores of other families and individuals do in her situation. They went to an extended stay hotel, and fast forward, Celeste, she's diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer, and she at first was really resistant to seeking help. She had this very proud, still does, a very proud kind of sensibility. She's incredible. She's charismatic. She's brilliant. In another life, she would have been the CEO of a company. And she was like, I'm not going to put the term homeless on myself. She had this kind of name it and claim it theology. Like, if I put that label on myself, I will become that thing. And she was so determined not to have that label. But finally, she realized that she had fallen into the hotel trap, as it's called, and she couldn't get out. And she fished out the homeless resource list that her school social worker had given her at her son's school. She called the numbers. What she heard again and again when she could talk to anyone was, you have to go to the coordinated entry site. You have to go to the coordinated entry site. And that's called Gateway Center here in Atlanta. I know this is already dragging on, so I'll just try to speed through it. I what I witnessed, and again, this wasn't just with Celeste, was when she finally sat down with this caseworker, she came prepared to tell her story. She came prepared to talk about the injustice of the eviction, to talk about, she brought work records, she brought the police, all this stuff. And the caseworker was very nice, but she said, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I have a standardized list of questions I have to ask you. And the purpose of these questions was to assess Celeste's vulnerability, as it's referred to. And when Celeste answered these questions, when was the last time you were incarcerated? Do you use drugs? How often? Have you ever been diagnosed with a behavioral health disorder? On and on. And Celeste is like, no, never, none. Um, Finally, the woman, and Celeste describes where they're living. The woman looks up and says, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. We don't have anything for you. You, your vulnerability score is too low." And Celeste is like, "What about my cancer? Doesn't that make me vulnerable enough?" And the woman says, "I'm sorry, you, like that, no, it doesn't. And besides, you don't fit the definition of literal homelessness as determined by HUD. You have to be in a shelter or on the street." And and Celeste, I mean, she's like completely bewildered, and she's like, she didn't want to go to a shelter because she had heard horror stories about Atlanta shelters, but then she was like, okay, like fine, if we have to go to a shelter to get help, to get housing assistance, we'll go to a shelter. And then the woman looks up. She's like, "Wait, I'm sorry. You mentioned that your son just turned 14. None of the family shelters here allow boys over the age of 12. So he would have to go to a men's shelter by himself. You would have to be split up." And she was like, "No way. We're absolutely." So she left Gateway Center empty-handed. The line was stretching around the building just as long as it had been that morning. And I say all of this because these definitions, again, there is a violence attached to them. It's not just a matter of parceling out scarce resources. Her experience was denied, and there was something. I mean, Kafkaesque is often thrown around, but there's no other phrase to describe it. This feeling of like, okay, this squalid, abysmal extended stay hotel with rodents and the ceiling cave, like you're not homeless there, even though it's a week to week arrangement. It's so precarious. But if you went outside to your sidewalk, then we would consider you homeless. Then you could be eligible. So I say all of this just to show how arbitrary and really cruel this gatekeeping can be, this policing of boundaries, and the very real world consequences that it has for so many people. All of Celeste's neighbors in the hotel were in a similar predicament, and there are thousands just here in Atlanta living in these hotels.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brian. And you echo a lot of what Evie spoke about, talking about some of the challenges of living without stable housing. And both of you illustrated, I think, very well the detriment of relying on these really narrow definitions of homelessness and the access to services and supports that people have based on that. I want to shift a little bit to you, Shannon, now, and just kind of ask you about some of the unique challenges by Black and LGBTQ plus communities, who we all know are more likely to be impacted by homelessness. What are some of these unique challenges these communities face, and how are systems reinforcing these challenges?
How aren't they? um, well, clearly, as I mentioned earlier, when you look at the experience of people who are faced with homelessness, we oftentimes find that a part of the narrative is discrimination. So when it comes to LGBTQ folks, you have higher rates of housing discrimination. Yes, right? Do we have policies federally that say on paper housing discrimination is illegal? Of course we do. But what we know is that policy rarely translates into everyday lives. And when you're talking about individuals who oftentimes experience a level of powerlessness. Who are they to contend with the individuals who are actively discriminating against them? Family rejection, as I said at the top of our discussion, is a big one. We know that LGBTQ folks experience family rejection at alarming rates. Criminalization. So let's think about um, the experience of somebody who is in homelessness. More than likely, you will engage in survival crimes. And those survival crimes will oftentimes put you in direct contact with, prison systems, and carceral systems, which will ultimately create a level of recidivism. But we know too, when it comes to housing, oftentimes when they do that background check, if they see that there was some type of arrest, particularly a felony, well, that can exclude you from potential housing, right? Wage inequity. So those are just some things to just name a few. Systems reinforce these things through biased assessments, if that makes sense for you, right? Unsafe shelter environments. I don't want to forget that one. It's so easy for people to say, well, just go to a shelter. Well, you know, as a member of the LGBTQ community, as a trans person, that's easier said than done, right? Like there's so many harms that can happen there, both from residents, but also from the staff as well. Policies that just flat out refuse and just ignore identity-based harm. Um, all of those things, I would say, really do reinforce those systems that create homelessness. I would even say that the systems that we're talking about actually result in longer homelessness and fewer exits to permanent housing. I, as you all know, I did housing assessments for many years, and I'm so proud to have, housed scores of, young people, particularly those from the LGBTQ community, and the level of bureaucracy that comes into place. It's oftentimes really hard, that rigid definition of HUD. Oftentimes, our young people, particularly folks in the LGBTQ community and outside of it, typically don't fit into that box. I'll say this in closing, is that oftentimes when I sat in front of folks and I was doing that cursory assessment, before they opened their mouths, I would say, hey, I just want to start off by saying what qualifies you for homelessness is being homeless on the street for a year, not couch surfing, being on the train, on the bus, outside. Okay. Um, and as the person sitting in front of me would listen to me, I would run it back to them and say, so tell me, how long have you been homeless? And they would share with me their stories about how long they've been homeless. They would share with me their stories of where they're living, right? Which was typically on the street. I would say, hey, you don't spend the night somewhere, correct? Because that would actually negate your homeless. And they would say, no, I don't spend the night anywhere. Great. So again, I am not saying anything in particular, but what I am saying is this: it is our job to let the individuals who are sitting in front of us know that this is a very bureaucratic system that has a lot of red tape, that is not invested in sentimentality. It is not invested in your story, as harrowing as it may be. What they are invested in is policy, um, checking the box. So I did the best I can proudly to prepare people in front of me for that box checking. And again, I am proud to say that I've housed about over 500 young people because of that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. I hope you guys in the audience are taking notes. Um, I want to, Evie, ask you another question. So we've heard you share and paint just a really vivid and clear picture of your experience being homeless. We've heard from Brian about some of the stories that he's captured and heard about being homeless. So we know that there's no singular experience of being homeless. Um, So keeping that in mind, if there are any policymakers listening today, what is one thing that you wish they better understood about homelessness?
I would start off by saying that homelessness is not something people earn. It's not a personal failure. It's a trauma and it can happen to anyone. And I believe that homelessness is a community issue. And I personally won't rest until I see a better future for my siblings and for everyone who's at risk of housing instability. It's really important to me that people don't have to go through what I went to just to survive. I also want policymakers to understand that homelessness doesn't have one look. It's not only street homelessness, it's also being doubled up. Families packed into overcrowded apartments, couch surfing, shelters, hotels, temporary placements, and staying in unsafe situations because alternatives are like even worse. Growing up, before entering foster care, as I mentioned earlier, my family was it was about 15 people in a one-bedroom apartment. 10 of those were children, two and the rest were adults. And it was really hard to find a sense of self in that kind of situation. And so I think oftentimes in our communities, these situations don't sound alarming, they don't sound concerning, but we tend to disassociate because these experiences have become normal. And I encourage us all to, as we're doing today, we're unlearning these things and we're relearning about what homelessness actually looks like. And I think that's a part of the system was built broken. And I think we need to unbuild that. And I think we need to start over. And the first thing that we can do is to educate ourselves. What we're doing here today is as what homelessness actually looks like and what actually causes it so that we can add preventative measures and actually help people before they end up on streets and encampments and in shelters and couch surfing and people who are in situations where they have to flee. And a part of my situation why I ended up homeless shortly after my fourth year of college is because I was in an unsafe situation that where I had to flee. And so in the midst of fleeing, I'm put into so much more trauma. And so a lot of rhetoric that surrounds people who are experiencing homelessness is that we deserve it. And I know for a fact that I didn't even deserve to have to flee. I didn't deserve what happened to me that caused me to be unsafe. I didn't deserve to have to flee. I didn't deserve to have to give up my life. And I didn't deserve to have to continuously go through homelessness for a prolonged period, which could have been avoided had I been eligible for programs that would have helped me earlier on, had they deemed me to be what I really was, which was without a home. And I encourage policymakers to think about the concept of a home and what having a home really means. And so I think a lot of people growing up where, I've never really experienced to this day what having a home actually is a permanent place where I belong. And I hope that I do soon one day. But a lot of us have never experienced what a permanent housing would feel like. And so I think this is something that I really desire for everybody walking this earth is for us to have um, permanent housing. And the first place we need to start is right here in our own communities in the city of Chicago.
Well, thank you for that, Evie. Um, Brian, listening to Evie's response, can you, and just considering, taking that into consideration, and what we know and what we've learned about the narrow definition that HUD provides about homelessness or for homelessness, and just I think the accumulation of some of the comments this evening, can you describe, well, first, can you describe the point in time count for us, and then the purpose and the implications of the findings of that annual count? Because I think all of that feeds some of what we've already heard tonight.
Yeah, so the point in time count is the federal homeless census. It's mandated that any community in the country, that's city, county in the country that is receiving HUD housing resources or homelessness resources, it is mandated that they conduct this count every year, and basically it involves volunteers, those who work at agencies, local agencies, nonprofits, social workers, people from churches, sort of fanning out across our cities and physically counting everyone who is either visible in an unsheltered environment. So again, like places not fit for human habitation, abandoned buildings, sidewalks, um, but also those who are in designated homeless shelters. So those two kind of populations, those in unsheltered situations and those who are in shelters, basically makes up uh, the target of this count. And yeah, as part of my reporting, I took part in the count one year, and it was striking. It was really, really startling to see how it works, to see how, I mean, capricious, arbitrary it is when you are, really having to decide, like, okay, I'm walking down the street. Who do I even stop and survey? Who do I stop and interview? A lot of it is based on personal biases about what homelessness again looks like. And there was one situation where I was with my team that I had been assigned, and there was a family in a station wagon, clearly living out of their station wagon. And our team leader basically told us not to talk to them. And so, that family came to stand in for all of the families I was following for my reporting. There was something kind of spectral and haunting about that, just ignoring them. And this point in time count, it is really important for giving us a kind of estimate, but it's also really important that we be clear about the the many, many, many people who literally don't count, who our country has said, you do not count. Your experience of homelessness does not count. Those, again, in doubled up arrangements, couch surfing, or those in these extended stay hotels. Um, and these families and individuals in those other circumstances, they literally don't count, and they've been written out of the story that we as a nation have told ourselves about homelessness, who it's happening to, and why it happens. They have been written out of that story. And so it's very consequential. The numbers that make it into the newspaper headlines are often uncritically just adopted, sort of like propaganda, how, journalists will sometimes uncritically reproduce the statements from police departments about a shooting, or in the same way, many journalists uncritically reproduce whatever it is that the city government or officials say about these numbers, and the numbers should be taken with a humongous grain of salt. Just here in Georgia, where I live, if you were to gather all of the families and individuals who were excluded from the point in time count, this most recent count, just those who are excluded, you could fill Truist Park, where the Braves play, 3 times over with all of those who are excluded from that count. And those seats in the stadium would be filled overwhelmingly with the faces of children. So that is who is being left out of the point in time count.
Yeah. So I'm just going to do a quick time check. We've got a little over 10 minutes left, and I've got at least 2 more questions that I'd like to ask. Shannon, I'm going to come to you with this next question, and we're going to shift the conversation just a little bit, because I'd love to hear your thoughts about some of the popular and often inaccurate narratives around homelessness, and then maybe talk some about the impact that what's happening on the federal level has had on how the city of Chicago serves the homeless population. And so my question for you is, in your opinion, how have changes during this administration, such as funding uncertainty, regulatory changes, or rhetoric around homelessness, affected Chicago's ability to serve people who experience homelessness?
How has the federal administration affected Chicago's ability to serve people experiencing homelessness? That's your question. Oh my goodness. I think that if you ever sat down and you talked to our dedicated and amazing housing providers, they would be able to tell you that the funding landscape has created so much instability in the workforce that it makes it devastatingly hard for individuals to go out and do the work that is necessary um, in terms of providing housing supports for, the vulnerable population. I would say too, just the level of dehumanizing rhetoric that just that's just out there is just astounding. The way that local capacity has just been drained, and we're shifting from solutions to blame, you know. And again, I'm struggling to answer the question because there's so much in such a little time. I mean, this climate has just made long-term planning harder just in general, right? Like gone are the days of the 5-year strategic plan when it comes to these things. So this funding desert creates this vacuum, right? This inability to do these longer strategic plans that are dedicated to helping folks who are experiencing homelessness. Constrained services, clearly. But again, just the emboldened narratives that criminalize poverty instead of addressing structural causes is really what we're seeing here more than ever. Look at certain cities where they literally put spikes on benches to keep folks from sleeping on them. That's what I mean by criminalizing homelessness. And that's just a small example, right? But that's the best way I can answer that right now without going over time. But yeah, it's becoming harder and harder because of this federal landscape that again has just boldly said that we don't care.
Thank you for that. This will be the last question, and this is for everyone. And it's really a call to action that I would like you all to share with the audience tonight. What can people do to be a part of the work to end homelessness in Chicago? Evie, how about we start with you?
Yeah, I just have to grab my chargers. I'm catching my breath a little bit, but um, my call to action, the very first thing you need to do before you approach something new or something that you're unfamiliar with is to educate yourself and to unlearn myths about homelessness. See what homelessness is like beyond stereotypes. Many people are working, parenting, and studying. Use your voice, vote, community influence to support broader definitions and early intervention. Be brave enough to sit in that discomfort of what it's going to be like to unlearn and relearn about what it looks like to experiencing homelessness and have empathy. I have such a hopeful spirit for what we can achieve because what I care about is people. Personally, I care about people having hobbies. Like I wanted them to be able to open up a book, take up a sport, take up anything. And we can't even get there. We can't even help people have hobbies because we don't have homes. We don't have consistent access to food and water. And so I want, and I'm sure we all do, want people to lead very happy and full and beautiful lives. And the first thing we can do before we approach anything to fix it, because the system was built broken, and so we don't want to cause more harm so we must approach it with knowing that we are not equipped right now and that we need to learn as much as possible and open our hearts to being wrong and being uncomfortable. And I'm sometimes uncomfortable when I'm having to learn and relearn things. And I think together, if we can approach it together, we can definitely find a solution where every person can experience a full and happy life.
Thank you so much, and sorry to catch you out of breath, but thank you very much. Shannon.
What can people do? Okay, what can people do? Man, that's a loaded question. Support policies that treat housing as a human right and not a reward. How about that? I'll just say that. Housing is not a reward. Housing is not something that should be synonymous with an if, and if you do this or if you become that, right? No, housing is a basic, I won't even say a basic, right? Is an essential need. So I will just leave us with that. Do not treat housing as a reward. It is a human right. Oh, let me just say this too. Um, Fund frontline organizations. Let's just be very tangible also. Fund frontline organizations because, these are the folks that are doing this work. We're a policy organization and we provide, the safety nets for the frontline orgs, but those dollars need to be going to frontline organizations. Challenge yourselves, challenge dehumanizing narratives. You know what? I'm just going to say it. Think about all the times that people have said bum, right? Those type of things we need to be conscious of. We need to think about how we dehumanize folks who are experiencing homelessness and hold elected officials accountable for solutions that address root causes. Um, Poverty shouldn't be a punishment. I'm done now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. And Brian, same question.
Um, I feel like compassion is great, empathy is great. We all need more empathy in our lives and in our world. But what I really think is going to finally move the dial on this catastrophe is anger, is like people just being really angry, a kind of productive anger, not an anger without an object or a target, but a really clear, productive anger. Because what I saw again and again was just how utterly preventable all of this suffering is. It is so unnecessary, it's so avoidable. And in the richest nation on the planet, um, it should be a scandal that anybody is without a roof overhead, like this most basic human necessity. And what we've allowed housing to become in this country, how we've allowed it to be hoarded up and then auctioned off to the highest bidder. And, we don't call it price gouging. We don't call it price gouging during an undeclared state of emergency, which is what this housing crisis is. We just call it the market. We just call it supply and demand economics. We just call it capitalism. And I know that right now I'm not speaking the way journalists are supposed to speak. I've given up any pretense of like being a dispassionate observer or just a documenter. But I think we need to be angry at what we've allowed housing to become. And on that note of prevention, what can people do? Like prevention is so key in all of this. Not only, and I noticed that in the chat or in the Q&A, a question about prevention. It's not only because it makes like good fiscal sense that it's much more expensive to to bring wraparound services much further along, but for moral reasons, for like homelessness can be prevented, but it also opens up an entire domain of activity that is often left out of the conversation about homelessness and homeless services. And I'm talking about eviction defense. I'm talking about tenant organizing. I'm talking about all of the ways that housing can become more secure for people who currently have it, and where interventions like direct cash assistance can happen before the loss can harden into trauma that then needs to be undone. What it means to intervene before is so crucial. And I feel like a lot of the conversation needs to shift in that direction. But I also am convinced that it will only shift, not when people, read yet another article about this abstract thing called the homelessness crisis, but when we feel the visceral human reality of the catastrophe on the street, of people being criminalized for just existing outside. And again, that vast world of homelessness that exists out of sight.
Well, I want to say thank you to all of you for your thoughts, for your insights, for just providing such a clear picture of the importance of the work that the Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness does, as well as other homelessness advocates across the city. I want to remind the audience that we've got a Q&A coming up right now. And so again, I'm going to thank the panelists one last time, and I'm going to turn it over to M now, who will guide us through some questions we've received from the audience. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much to our panelists for such rich and thorough information about the various context around our data today. Thank you for folks who also were able to share some of their own stories, and Brian for expanding on qualitative information on your data as well. How I'm going to do this now is we've been answering some questions in the chat as we've gone along. One of the themes that I've seen here in the chat that I'd like to address, and I'm going to start with a little bit of a response here, and then I'm going to bunt it over to Brian to finish, is a question about some of the local causes of homelessness, and especially around, is it a lack of money or is it a lack of housing? And what's going on there, specifically in Chicago. One of the things that we found in putting together this year's homelessness estimate report is we were also able, also from the American Community Survey, to look at the rates of housing vacancies in Chicago. And the most recent data available suggests that there's at least 109,000 housing vacancies in Chicago. And recall that our estimate is over 58,000. So that means that there is almost twice as many housing vacancies in Chicago as the number of people that are experiencing homelessness. It's not that we don't have the housing stock available, it's that we do not have access to affordable housing. So that's one of the first responses to that consideration. But Brian, I'm wondering if you might be able to expand on some of that a little bit too.
On some of the local causes. And yeah, I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about much, but I feel is absolutely critical in this discussion is the way that, I know I once felt like believed this, that homelessness is sort of a crisis of poverty. It's the most extreme form of poverty. And that homelessness is sort of um, that it springs up in the poorest areas of the city, and even the way that homelessness traditionally has been segregated geographically in like Skid Row areas. I think that sort of bolsters that stereotype. But what I think is really striking about the skyrocketing homelessness we've seen over the last several years in this country is that it is not a crisis of poverty, but of prosperity. It's born, it is emerging not out of cities where there is this failing economy, the hollowed out urban core. It is spring up out of cities that have economies that are thriving, just not for the poor and working class in these cities. And so the relationship, the dialectic, the dynamic between development, ultra development, on the one hand, and deprivation on the other, the ways that, people, and there's a heavily racialized dimension to all of this, to be sure, how people are being pushed out, not just out of the neighborhoods they grew up in through gentrification and the revitalization of urban space, but being pushed out of housing altogether. So that's a big sort of ingredient in the mix, I think, that is easy to leave out. But if you look at the regions, you look at the cities where homelessness is most acute, what is the variable that all of those cities share? It's not high rates of drug addiction. It's not disproportionate rates of mental illness. What the one variable that all of these cities and regions share is this chasm between what people are earning in their jobs or the other forms of income like disability, SSI, and what it costs to have a place to live. So yeah, I would say that that's a really big determinant.
Thank you so much, Brian. Um, my apologies. One second. Let me wrap my mind around a question here. I was listening to Brian and not thinking about, not looking at what that question to answer next. Um, I'll open this to any of the panelists. And Brian, maybe since we just answered, seeing if Evie or Shannon want to answer first. One of the things when we think about policy to try to address homelessness is so much we are often thinking about um, how to assist people that have already gone over, that have already been forced over that brink, right? And into homelessness. And of course, it's necessary because people need that housing now, right? How do we design policies, or what ideas can we be encouraging locally that would be able to both prevent, or potentially, how do we target both preventing homelessness and addressing that need while still continuing to support those and assist those to gain housing?
Sure. I don't think that the policy design is the issue. I think that we look at policy far too often, right? Illinois actually has some very good policies, and we can always do better. What we don't have is enough accountability, to put it frank. These landlords, these folks who have amassed tremendous wealth and society know exactly what is legal and what is not. But again, there is no accountability. No one is watching. Nobody is holding their feet to the fire. No one is warning them. No one is punishing them for such things. So yes, right. I can always um, think of a myriad of policies that could be added to reinforce or tighten um, security to prevent folks from becoming or experiencing homelessness. But really, until there is a level of accountability that will make folks fearful of violating policy, then all the policy in the world is for naught.
Thank you, Shannon. I think that's important consideration. We can write a lot of policies, but if there's not accountability on the other side of that, and we see that with the Just Housing Amendment here in Cook County too, right? Thank you so much, Shannon. Uh, Evie, what ideas here invigorates you? What are you interested in organizing around?
Um, my own personal buy-in when it comes to homelessness in Chicago is always going to be a bit focused on youth base. I think that had I as a child maybe saw what housing looked like permanent housing looked like, if someone near me had some type of form of permanent housing, then I would have known the signs a lot earlier on. And maybe I would have maybe had somebody to rely on when I was going through what I was going through at the time. Because a lot of situations, like it's normal to be having to go stay with granny, for the whole family got to stay with granny for a while to go stay with a friend and to like live in like other like unsafe situations. These things are very, very normalized. And so, what I'm hoping to see as far as like what we can do better as policies is try to dismantle as much as possible the ones that are rooted in racism and discrimination and bigotry, because these are the things that will be imprinted on the young minds of children who are, engaged in systems. And these systems often take strip a lot of self from these individuals. I can recall when in foster care, I was 12 years old, and my foster parent told me that I was smart enough, I was capable enough to take care of myself. And I agreed with her. I did not give her any rebuttal. And she said to me, my foster sister, who was white and a month older than me, and my foster brother, who was also her brother, uh, He was a year or two younger than me. She said they don't know how to take care of themselves, so they need to get adopted. They need to be connected to resources. And so, in a lot of systems that we have in this country, this is the lens in which we look at people who are victims of poverty and victims of unfortunate circumstances. We see that, okay, you're strong still, even though you're going through so much hardship. So even though I could help you, even though I could help you get adopted, and they were offered to get adopted so many times up until the time that they were like 17, 18, and Black and brown children are very we don't get that same experience in foster care. And because I went through this, I was hyper aware of these predicaments, and I saw it again and again when I was in these places, when I was in the shelters, when I was in other temporary living situations, when I was applying for um, uh, short-term cash assistances. I saw that there are times there is a huge disparity in who gets help and who is prioritized, and how do people like view you. I've had people accuse me of being dishonest for no reason, no apparent reason, when I'm applying for resources. So I do think that the people are also a huge thing that we need to focus on and we need to fix. If you don't have the right people in the right places administering these programs and overseeing these policies, I do think that, like the other panelists mentioned, without accountability. And if you don't have the right people enforcing accountability, then you're going to be in this like repeated cycle of you create something that looks great on paper, but in reality, the way it actually plays out, the people get to pick and choose when to follow these policy and when to enforce them. So I think we need also to make sure that we have the right people in those places, and we need to have eyes on what is going on as much as possible.
Thank you, Evie. Thank you for sharing a little bit more about your experiences and how that you've gained power from that in advocacy and connecting and working with others. Uh, a question I'm going to that was answered in the chat here, but I'm going to lift up and repeat, was from one of our attendees that was asking about the Grants Pass Supreme Court decision. For folks that may not be aware of what the Grants Pass Supreme Court decision was, is the Supreme Court ruled that municipalities can create laws that make it illegal to sleep outside, that they can fine and jail people. And since that decision, we have seen a significant increase in such laws. Sometimes they're called anti-camping bans. And here in Illinois, we are the state that is second in the number of municipalities that have tried to pass such discriminatory and cruel policies. There was a question in the chat if there was any updates on criminalization and experience of unsheltered homelessness. Doug, our executive director, who we'll hear from shortly, says that we continue to see municipalities throughout the country and in Illinois adopt ordinances that criminalize homelessness after the court ruled that could be constitutional. Dozens of municipalities in Illinois have adopted these ordinances, and CCH is working with partners through the state to fight their adoption and enforcement. And one thing like to lift up here is earlier we talked about what calls to action, what we as a community and individuals can do. And one of the things that we have seen come from this numbers of attempts to pass anti-camping bans is community response pushing back against them. For instance, a couple months ago, or maybe even just a month ago, Arlington Heights attempted to pass such a ban, but the community responded. It came out to city council, and that ban was not passed. This is a really good evidence that when we stand together as a community, that we can stand for all of our neighbors, and we do have power to create change and to respect all community members. See, there was one more question. Just double checking. All right, my friends, thank you so much to our panelists. Once again, your insights and your voice today has been powerful. Thank you to our attendees for all of your questions and your thoughtfulness. One of our goals in this is education. So we encourage sharing what you've learned here today. This earlier, my colleague put the link for the full homelessness estimate report in the chat. It's on our webpage. And like I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will also be shared out. Thank you so much. To close us out today, I'm going to turn it over to Doug, the Executive Director of Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness.
Thank you, Em. Huge thanks to all of our panelists, to Brian, to Shannon, to Evie, to Karenina for moderating, for moderating the Q&A and for sharing the data on the new homeless estimate. Really appreciate all that work. I'm just want to close this out by just talking about what we can do in this moment. We didn't talk a lot about the incredible threats that we are faced with by action on the federal government to try to change policy, to change funding, to negatively impact what we know works, which is permanent housing and supports. There's a lot in flux right now. There's a lot that's blurry and unclear about what's going to happen in the future with funding from the federal government. So we encourage you to stay informed, to look for opportunities to take action. Claire will share in the chat a link to our Take Action page so you can sign up for action alerts to monitor what the opportunities are as we continue to push back on these attempts to decimate a really important safety net for folks experiencing homelessness. I encourage you to get involved in your neighborhood, look for local advocacy opportunities, support unhoused neighbors. There's a lot of amazing mutual aid groups in the city of Chicago doing wonderful work to support people living in encampments. If there's one in your neighborhood that you can connect with to try to be a local informal support to folks who are unhoused in your community, that's a great way to get involved. And then continue to just educate yourselves and share this information with others. Share this report with others. Share Brian's book, amazing book, with others that really helps people see the real stories behind these numbers. The more people know and understand what homelessness is about, the more public will and eventually political will have to solve it. So thank you to everyone. Thank you so much for your time and your being here with us today. Wish you the best.